The first time I realized my life was not mine came on the night I thought I had everything. The cameras were live, the champagne glasses glittered, and the applause wrapped around me like a promise. Then the screen behind us flickered and a video appeared. Me in a room I had never entered, saying words I had never spoken. My smile stayed frozen, but my chest burned as strangers in the comments called me a fraud. They told me I didn't belong. They didn't know I had already decided to fight, not with screams, but with something stronger. The wedding had been painted as a fairy tale from the start, a sweeping estate with columns that gleamed under rented spotlights, guests dressed like they were auditioning for magazines, and a live stream that ran across TikTok, Instagram, and a half-dozen other platforms at once. They wanted the world to see me wrapped in lace and promise, stepping into a dynasty I had no part in building. For a moment, I let myself believe the applause and flashing cameras were genuine. For a moment, I thought the warmth was real. Then the screen behind us pulsed. At first, it looked like static, just a glitch in the feed. But the image sharpened, and there I was, alone in a hotel room I had never seen, leaning close to a man I had never touched. My voice, perfectly cloned, whispered confessions I had never made. The crowd gasped before I even understood. My smile locked in place, porcelain against the burn rising in my chest. In the comments, scrolling faster than I could read, strangers typed one word over and over: fraud. The music faltered but did not stop. The officiant looked briefly to my husband's mother, and she smiled that gracious, controlled smile that said everything was fine. The cameras kept rolling. I lifted my champagne glass, though my hands shook, and at that exact moment someone brushed past and spilled red wine across my gown. It bled down the white fabric like proof. The fairy tale shattered with one digital flicker and one clumsy accident. I stood there painted in scandal, baptized in their design. I kept breathing because I had trained myself to. I kept smiling because I knew the power of a face that did not crack. But inside, I marked the first wound, cataloged it like evidence. That night, when the fireworks rose above the gardens, my phone lit up with a new comment from an anonymous account. "Welcome to the family, liar." For the next week, I played the role they needed. The family offered statements to the press, compassionate, polished, insisting they did not believe the video. Behind closed doors, I felt the shift. Eleanor, my new mother-in-law, never accused me outright, but every word from her mouth carried implication. "These things can be so damaging for a brand," she sighed, eyes sliding to mine. "Reputation is fragile." My husband nodded, silent, and silence was worse than accusation. I had once been a crisis strategist. I had salvaged campaigns that should have collapsed under lies and fire. I had told CEOs when to speak and when to let silence save them. But in this house, in this family, I said nothing. I let them think I was only the woman they had chosen to display. I knew better than to reveal cards too early. At night, when the mansion finally went quiet, I opened my laptop. I dissected the deepfake frame by frame, following its digital fingerprint. The video hadn't just been uploaded by strangers, it had been boosted. Paid traffic, coordinated shares, trending acceleration. Someone inside the family had fueled it. I traced the metadata not to a random troll, but to an account associated with a streaming giant that Eleanor's charity partnered with. I had seen this pattern before. Corporations laundering perception through family-friendly facades. The coincidence was too neat. I began leaving my phone on record when I moved through the halls. I pretended to tidy up the library, to adjust place settings, to thank staff. One night, drifting past Eleanor's office, I heard her voice low and satisfied. The clip worked better than expected. We'll roll out the next phase soon. By the time the markets adjust, she'll be irrelevant. Another voice answered, muffled, but the words hit like steel. We'll bake her score into the model. Once the AI flags her, the system will never let her rise. I stopped breathing, holding still against the heavy wood of the door. They weren't just after my marriage. They wanted to code me into failure, to make me a pariah not just in gossip, but in every algorithm that judged credit, employment, even travel. In a world where a number meant survival, they would brand me defective. I closed the laptop that night with trembling hands, but my mind no longer trembled. They thought they had found a weakness. They didn't know that I had been waiting, years before I met their son, for the moment someone would try to bury me in noise. The game had shifted. The fairy tale was finished, and I was done pretending I was part of their dream. The morning after the whispers reached me, I shut everything down. My Instagram, my TikTok, even the LinkedIn account I had polished for years, all gone with a series of clicks. My profile pictures vanished into gray placeholders. To the outside world, it looked like I had broken under pressure, deleting my digital self the way disgraced figures always did. Headlines called it a retreat. Commenters called it proof. And Eleanor, ever the actress, tilted her head at breakfast and said softly, "Sometimes it's better to disappear." But disappearing was a mask. I had not erased myself. I had hidden the blade. In silence, in absence, I gained room to move. From a separate device buried under innocuous emails, I opened a line to someone I had once saved from ruin. He was a hacker then, raw and reckless. Now he was something else, a ghost in systems that claimed to be untouchable. I wired money through encrypted wallets, not enough to trace but more than enough to open doors. Within hours, he dropped the first package into my inbox, a tangle of files stripped from servers too high for casual thieves. At first, the documents were meaningless. Numbers, codes, wallets filled with strings of alphanumeric hash. But I had spent years untangling messes meant to confuse. Slowly, patterns emerged. Funds routed through NFT marketplaces, art that never hung on walls, trades inflated until they collapsed into silence. Eleanor's charity appeared in line after line, a funnel disguised as generosity. They weren't just laundering reputations, they were laundering millions. The image that stayed with me was not the ledgers, though. It was a broken mirror I found in the storage room that week, edges bound with red thread. It had belonged to one of Eleanor's designers, she said dismissively, but to me it was a symbol, a face fractured and bound back together, fragile, but deliberate. That was who I had to become, stitched but unbroken, weak in appearance but sharp in truth. I fed the files back to my contact, asked him to dig deeper. Days later, a single folder arrived with a red tag. Inside, a trail leading straight into the heart of the family's accounts. They had built their dynasty not on investments, but on fraud disguised as culture. The NFT art they flaunted in magazines was little more than a washing machine. My pulse hammered as I read line after line, each transaction a nail in their own coffin. The fairy tale was unraveling thread by thread, and they had no idea I was holding the scissors. Still, evidence without strategy is noise. I needed allies, and I needed reach. That was when I turned to my own past, to the startup I had quietly built before marrying into their empire. My shares were still mine, untouched by marital contracts. A small stake, perhaps, but liquid enough to fund something bigger. I sold a portion, moved the money through layered accounts, and placed it directly into the hands of those who could fight with me. First came the hacker, now bound to me by more than nostalgia. Then a journalist I had once fed scraps of truth when corporations lied too boldly. And finally, the most unexpected, a mid-level employee from the family's own conglomerate, worn down by years of silence, desperate for someone to believe her. Together, they formed a constellation, faint at first but growing brighter. The journalist confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Eleanor's hands were not clean alone. The family had contracted with a shadow firm to build and distribute deepfakes, not just of me, but of political opponents, rivals, anyone inconvenient. It wasn't about me, not really. I was just another name in a ledger of targets, their own daughter-in-law offered up to maintain control. Then the contract arrived. It was buried deep in the leaks, masked as an innocuous service agreement. But once decoded, its clauses were undeniable. Payment schedules, delivery dates, instructions for narrative management, and at the bottom, the signatures. Eleanor's, yes. The uncle's, of course. But one more line curved across the page. Familiar, impossible to mistake. Theo. My husband's name, written in ink, binding him to the very campaign that had gutted me. I sat in the dark of my study, screen glowing cold against my face, and felt the ground tilt beneath me. Betrayal was no longer implication. It was fact, documented, contractual. Every kiss at our wedding, every whispered promise, every silence he had offered instead of defense, it had all been part of the same ink stroke. I closed the file, but the signature burned into my vision. The mask I had worn, fragile, broken, stitched with red thread, tightened around me until I could barely breathe. But I did not break. If anything, the threads pulled me straighter. They had declared war in secret. Now it was my turn to answer in kind. For the first time since the wedding, I felt momentum tilt in my favor. The journalist I trusted released the first wave of articles, quiet but sharp, threading together the leaks into a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. Screenshots of contracts, shell companies tied to NFT laundering, whispers of algorithm tampering. The story caught like kindling. My phone vibrated with alerts, comments questioning Eleanor's charity, threads dissecting suspicious trades, viewers connecting dots I had left scattered like breadcrumbs. For a moment, the world seemed ready to see them as they truly were. I leaned into that hope, feeding the journalist another set of files, planting them in forums where whistleblowers thrived. Each release was careful, calculated, a long con in itself. The plan was simple: expose enough truth to fracture their illusion, then strike with the signature, Theo's betrayal, when they were weakest. I imagined the shock on his face when the ink he had placed so casually became his undoing. I thought I was ahead. Then the second video dropped. It was smoother, sharper, impossible to dismiss. Me, seated in a luxury suite, stacks of money slid across the table. My voice, again flawless, thanked a faceless man for his support. The lighting was perfect, the angles cruelly precise. Even I had to pause, my breath caught in my throat, because for one dreadful second, I almost believed it. The internet didn't hesitate. The hashtags spread within hours. Yes, fake bride. It wasn't just trending. It was consuming. Clips spliced, slowed down, replayed with arrows and circles, proof of guilt in pixels. Talk shows dissected my gestures. Commentators shook their heads. Too polished to be fake, one said. If this is true, she orchestrated everything, another declared. My allies faltered. Even the journalist, once confident, hesitated to publish further pieces with my name attached. I sat in the dim light of my office, the sound of notifications an endless storm, and felt the floor tilt. My reflection in the laptop screen looked like the woman in the video, accused, cornered, already condemned. For every leak I pushed forward, they answered with a weapon deadlier, cleaner. Their manipulation was not reactive. It was orchestrated, a symphony conducted from the shadows. That night, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, I found my sister-in-law standing there, eyes darting down the hall. She had never sought me out before. Now she looked carved from fear. "It happened to me, too," she whispered before I could speak. She told me about her own scandal years earlier, a video that showed her in compromising scenes that never existed. The family had buried it, not by clearing her name, but by silencing her. They had stripped her of ambitions, married her off quickly, ensured she never spoke out of turn. She was another casualty in their long history of reputational surgery. And as she spoke, I realized the deep fake of me was not an isolated attack, but part of their arsenal, honed over years, tested on their own. The true architect was not Eleanor, for all her cruelty. It was the uncle, Victor, the media titan whose reach extended across platforms, whose name never appeared in the scandals because he was the one scripting them. Eleanor was a mask, Theo was a pawn, but Victor was the puppeteer. By morning, my bank account was frozen. A fraud investigation, they said, routine. My startup account followed, locked under pending review. The employees I had once mentored called in panic. Their paychecks halted, their projects suspended. The empire I had built with careful hands was now a casualty of a war I hadn't chosen. I tried to withdraw cash, but even my cards failed. The financial noose tightened in sync with the narrative strangling me online. With no liquidity, no credibility, I was a ghost, disappearing in real time. Theo came home that evening with papers in hand. He didn't look at me as he placed them on the table. "It's for the best," he said, his voice rehearsed, empty. I opened the folder and saw the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Attached, a clause drafted with surgical precision. I would walk away with nothing. No assets, no claims, no rights. My husband, my supposed protector, had chosen the side of silence, then the side of betrayal. The ink that once bound us now sought to erase me. The fairy tale was ash. The long con I had believed was mine had been theirs all along. And as I stared at the divorce papers, my reflection warped in the polished table, I understood I had reached rock bottom. Ashes have a way of hiding embers. The night I signed nothing, refusing the divorce papers Theo dropped on the table, I realized silence had been my prison. If their war was waged through spectacle, then spectacle would be my weapon too. That was when I built the Phoenix Protocol. The plan was simple, almost primitive. Tell stories the way the internet consumed them, short, sharp, serial. I created a channel under a name that belonged to no one, faceless and anonymous. My first video wasn't a defense, it was a story. Part 1, The Bride Who Wasn't. A voice, distorted enough to hide but clear enough to sting, described a woman whose wedding was hijacked by a video she never made. Images rolled with it, not of me, but of symbols, a dress stained crimson, a mirror cracked down the middle, a glass of wine spilling over. The audience didn't need my face. They needed a story that smelled like theirs. Within hours, comments surged. "This happened to my friend. I know someone who lost her job because of a fake video." Part 2, please. That was the key. Endings that demanded another. By the time I released Part 2, The Algorithm's Cage, strangers were hooked, not because they pitied me, but because they recognized themselves in the trap. Then I did something riskier. I reached out to the silent ones, victims who had been buried under the same tactics. A college student whose scholarship was revoked after a clip of her cheating exam circulated. A journalist discredited with fabricated tapes. Even my sister-in-law, trembling but resolute, agreed to tell her story in whispers that became waves online. Each episode widened the lens, showing that the family's cruelty wasn't a personal vendetta, but a system, orchestrated, monetized. The narrative shifted. Instead of fraudulent bride, the trending tags became Docker AI fakes. Who controls? Truth. See faces stolen. For the first time, doubt entered the conversation. News anchors, cautious and careful, began admitting the possibility that deep fakes were weaponized. Questions rose. Who benefits when women are erased by lies? Who gains power when voices are discredited? The fairy tale they had spun began to unravel in public daylight. Then came the summons, a court order, official, sealed, naming Eleanor. She was to appear not as a matriarch, but as a respondent in a case of fraud and defamation. I held the paper in my hands and felt heat rise through me, the embers catching flame. But power never concedes without resistance. The family fought back, desperate to plug the cracks. They tightened their grip on media outlets, tried to flood feeds with counter-stories, videos of Eleanor clasping pearls, insisting she too was a victim of malicious technology. But their overreach exposed them further. Investors noticed, and investors do not love scandal. The calls began. Silent withdrawals, meetings canceled, funding pulled. Share prices dipped, then plummeted. The empire was bleeding, not from my words, but from the vacuum of trust. Victor's media empire stuttered under pressure. Every broadcast now questioned, every clip scrutinized for edits. What had once been absolute control now felt like noise, unraveling in real time. The investigation went public. Journalists I had never met uncovered paper trails linking the charity's funds to laundering schemes disguised as cultural patronage. AI scoring algorithms had been tampered with, blacklisting individuals who had crossed them. The lie was not just my marriage, it was systemic rot. One evening, I walked past the city square where their company logo once glowed on a massive billboard. Someone had painted a thick red slash across it. It stayed there for days untouched, as if the city itself had passed judgment. I stood among strangers who didn't know my name and felt the burn in my chest transform into something fierce. I was no longer alone. Then the final twist of irony, a clerical error in the divorce filing, a slip born of arrogance. Buried in the paperwork was a transfer clause mishandled by their own lawyers. In their rush to strip me of everything, they had overlooked a line that granted me ownership of a single property, the guest mansion on the edge of the estate. My name, unchallenged, sat on the deed. When I received confirmation from the county records, I laughed for the first time in months. It was not joy. It was the sound of fire catching after too long in the cold. They had tried to erase me with ink and lies, but their mistake had placed a cornerstone in my hands. One mansion may not be an empire, but it was proof that the phoenix had wings, and the fire was only beginning. The world that once called me a fraud now branded me something else. The Phoenix Bride, the woman who rose from ashes to expose the empire that tried to erase her. News anchors framed my face beside words like resilience and courage. Hashtags that once mocked me now carried wings of fire. But adoration is a double-edged blade. The louder the praise, the sharper the suspicion. Crowds celebrated me, yet whispers followed close behind. She destroyed them, some said, burned down her own family. At cocktail parties, acquaintances looked at me like I was radioactive, a contagion of ruin. Old friends stopped answering calls. Even employees from my startup, once proud to stand beside me, now walked with lowered heads. Their funding was frozen by regulators who had suddenly decided to investigate. They were casualties not of their making, but of mine. And though I told myself I fought for truth, their anxious eyes asked me the question I could not escape. Was the cost worth it? The praise tasted like ash. Fame is not freedom. It is a cage made of other people's expectations. I had fought to expose the lies, and now I stood in the center of another narrative, this time as both hero and destroyer. I was no longer invisible, but I was not entirely clean. The line between my victories and my destruction blurred. Then came the message from my hacker ally. He wrote without preamble, "There's one more file. You need to see it before they do. The super file," he called it. Encrypted, hidden deeper than the rest, it took him weeks to pull from the servers. When I opened it, my breath caught. It wasn't about Eleanor or Victor or Theo. It was about me, my past, before the mansion, before the dress, before the cameras. Emails, contracts, discreet communications from the years I worked as a crisis strategist. In black and white. I had orchestrated campaigns to bury scandals for powerful clients, manipulated public perception to protect reputations I knew were brittle. I had played the game long before they turned it against me. The irony was suffocating. The very skills that made me dangerous now painted me as no different than them. If this file leaked, the Phoenix Bride would be unmasked as a hypocrite, a manipulator cloaked in righteousness. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen, and for the first time, I wondered if they were right. Victor struck then, seizing the moment with surgical precision. He stepped into the light, no longer content to pull strings from the shadows. A broadcast aired across every channel his empire controlled. His face filled the screens, polished and confident, as he presented the file I had just seen. "Elena Carter," he declared, "is not the victim she pretends to be. She has built her career on deception, weaponizing media just as she accuses us of doing. This is not justice. It is hypocrisy." The screen split, and there I was, caught in a mirror image with Eleanor. Two women staring back, both painted as manipulators, two sides of the same coin. The broken mirror I once imagined, stitched with red thread, now shattered entirely. No thread, no repair, just shards. And then Theo appeared. My husband, my betrayer, stood beside Victor, the weight of his signature on contracts now matched by his voice. "I cannot remain silent anymore," he said, his tone measured, rehearsed. "She is not who she claims to be. She destroyed my family, and I cannot stand by her lies." The betrayal landed heavier than the first time, not because I did not expect it, but because he did it so publicly, so willingly. He aligned himself with the very man who had weaponized our marriage, choosing empire over intimacy, spectacle over truth. In that moment, I understood that my war was no longer against a family. It was against an entire system that thrived on control and shadows. The final blow came swiftly. A shadow ban, whispered at first, then enacted in silence. One by one, my accounts vanished. Not deleted, not hacked, erased. Search results no longer showed my name. Videos disappeared from feeds. My channel, the Phoenix Protocol, became a ghost no one could find. It was not just censorship, it was annihilation. The system that had elevated me now made me invisible again, as though I had never existed. I sat alone in the mansion that bore my name, the only thing left in my possession, and felt the crushing weight of silence return. The fire I had built flickered against a storm designed to suffocate it. I had risen, yes, but had I only risen to be cut down more spectacularly? The phoenix was aflame, but ashes still loomed. When the silence became absolute, I understood that their final weapon was not slander, but erasure. To vanish someone from the networked world was to kill them without blood. No records, no history, no voice. It was the same as death, but death can be a threshold as much as an end. If the platforms were closed, then I needed something that did not rely on platforms at all. The mansion became my war room. I cleared out its hollow luxury, filled the rooms with cables, servers, and screens. With what little liquidity I could still move, I called in the hacker who had once pulled me out of darkness. Together, we began building not a channel, but an ecosystem. Decentralized, unowned, ungoverned. A place where truth could not be deleted because it lived everywhere at once. We called it Truth Chain. The first block we minted was mine. Not a video, not a defense, but raw data. Contracts signed in secret, financial trails, metadata of the deep fakes that had scarred me. The blockchain etched them permanently, a ledger that no one could erase. Anyone, anywhere could verify. For the first time, the fight was not about narrative, but about proof, undeniable and incorruptible. The reaction was immediate. People who had once hesitated to believe now saw the receipts, line after line, immutable on a public ledger. The mansion filled with messages from strangers. Finally, evidence. This saved my sister. Now they can't silence us. And then, as if fire leapt from stone, others began to add their stories. Victims of falsified scores, manipulated clips, fabricated voices, all uploaded their truths into the chain. It was no longer my story. It was a chorus. News outlets tried to ignore it, but the chain was everywhere, mirrored across nodes in dozens of countries. A senator quoted it in a hearing. A university professor showed it to students. Courts demanded explanations. The old system, built on control of feeds and algorithms, had no answer for permanence. The narrative was no longer theirs to erase. I stood in the mansion's grand hall, empty of guests, and understood what it had to become. As long as I clung to it as a symbol of possession, I would remain chained to their world. So I signed it over. Every chandelier, every marble stair, every portrait that once loomed above me became part of the Phoenix Foundation, an endowment for victims of AI and deepfake abuse. The mansion would not be my fortress, but their refuge. It was sacrifice, but it was freedom. And when the deed was notarized, the news broke not through tabloids, but through Truth Chain itself. Hashtag Truth Chain Ignited. Not as gossip, but as a movement. What began as ashes turned into a blaze that could not be contained. Then the laws followed. Hearings turned into drafts, drafts into acts. A new framework outlawed manipulation of AI credit scores, criminalized deepfake defamation, forced transparency on platforms that had once thrived on shadows. Judges cited Truth Chain in their rulings, declaring blockchain-stored evidence admissible. For the first time, technology bent not to power, but to protection. Eleanor, stripped of her charities and her facade, faced trial. The evidence was not rumor, but records, each one immutable, each one a nail. She sat where once she had commanded, and the verdict carved away her grandeur. Victor, the puppet master, watched his empire collapse, advertisers fleeing, shareholders abandoning him. Theo stood beside him at first, then shrank away when the signatures he had placed bound him to the fraud. They lost not just wealth, but legacy. And me? I walked into rooms no longer as a victim, but as a witness. My name became a symbol not of scandal, but of survival. Schools invited me to speak. Lawmakers asked for counsel. The Phoenix Protocol was no longer a secret channel, but a principle. From destruction comes transformation. From lies comes unbreakable truth. I had begun this journey seeking belonging, but belonging had never been something to beg for or to inherit from a family's grudging acceptance. Belonging had to be built, chosen, earned. And I had built mine not in marble halls or wedding vows, but in the permanence of truth and the community that rose with me. On the day the foundation opened its doors, the square outside filled with people. Survivors, students, skeptics, all gathered under banners that bore no family crest, only the emblem of a flame stitched with red thread. Reporters swarmed, but I did not flinch. I stood on the steps and spoke the words that had carried me here. Belonging isn't inherited, it's built. From the edge of the crowd, I saw her, Eleanor. No pearls, no cameras, only age heavy on her shoulders. For the first time, her eyes did not glitter with calculation. They were simply tired. She did not approach, not yet, but her presence was enough. Even the architects of my ruin could not escape the truth that now bound us all. The ashes were behind me. The fire was mine. And for the first time, I was not afraid to let it burn.